Good evening, and welcome to this week's episode of Tuesday Tales of Terror. Yes, it is time again for another spooky story to chill your bones. And we are on episode 64, if you can believe it. And we are continuing through our journey into Alfred Hitchcock's anthology, Stories That Go Bump in the Night. And this is Something for the Dark by Edward D. Hoch. The monthly editorial sessions were held in the cork-walled conference room at Neptune magazine, and for Steve Foley, they were often the most interesting part of the office routine. He hadn't yet been on the Neptune editorial staff long enough to be bored by the individual mannerisms of the dozen or so men and women who lounged about the massive oak table, and it was one of the few times during the month when he felt he was actually contributing something toward the finished product on the printed page. Steve was still under 30 when he joined Neptune a year earlier. In his position as associate feature editor, he was surprised even to be included in the editorial planning sessions. But Mike Eldon, ashen-haired editor-in-chief, was a man who liked to have a full staff around the polished oak table. He'd brought the magazine a long way since the day when it was founded as a monthly compendium of fable, fashion, and food for those who travel the seven seas. Sounds interesting. Today, Neptune devoted more space to fact than fiction, and most of it was likely to take place on solid ground. If its emphasis was still on the adventure of travel, both adventure and travel were interpreted in their broadest meanings. "People," Mike Eldon said, hitting the polished surface with his fist. "That's what the readers care about. And that's what sells copies. No more stories about some mountain in the Andes. Now we do stories on the people who climb that mountain." It was a stock speech, and he repeated it in some form or another at almost every meeting, but no one could deny that it was mainly this philosophy which had helped boost Neptune's lagging circulation from 875,000 to nearly 2 million in 3 short years. "The October issue," Mike Eldon said, tapping the table with his rubber-tipped pencil. It was still early summer, but in the magazine business, you always live in the future. "Halloween, something for the dark." Steve Foley raised a finger. "I've got a funny one on my desk right now. Came in from an agent. A man and his wife on a camping trip a few months ago claimed they were attacked by some sort of great winged creature that even carried off their dog. He'd been about to reject the thing, but now it might just have possibilities." Eldon frowned down the table at him. "That's a bit out of Neptune's line. Still, it might be what we're looking for." He turned to the art director. "Harry, could you do a full page in color of a winged creature, a great winged creature, with red eyes maybe? Probably something like those old illustrations of the Jabberwock in Through the Looking Glass. Was it a Jabberwock by any chance, Steve? I'm just as skeptical as you are, but do you want something for October, or don't you?" "I want something our readers will believe, at least enough to scare them a little." He sighed and stopped tapping the pencil. "All right, what the hell? Look into it, Steve. Talk to the people and see if there's any truth at all in it. You got 10 days before we lock up the issue. If it looks good to you, we'll run it. But take a camera along, get some pictures of where it happened, whatever it was." That was how it started. Steve Foley phoned the agent who had submitted the article, a little Frenchman with a slight accent who worked out of his apartment on Central Park West. Pete, this is Steve over at Neptune. Everyone called him Pete because it was easier than trying to pronounce his real name. It's about this flying creature article you sent us by a fellow named Walter Vanguard. Oh, yes. What do you know about him? Any truth to it? I couldn't tell you. He's written a few outdoor items hunting, fishing, camping. I think I've sold 2 or 3 for him. I'm not getting rich on it. Ever meet him? Is he a phony? Doesn't seem like it from his letters. He and his wife live in a little town near the Pennsylvania border, not far from where they saw the creature. He's a tire salesman, but he likes the outdoors. I guess I'll have to go see him, Steve said. You're going to buy it? Probably, if they're not complete nuts. I want to get some pictures, too. Want me to go along? The agent offered. Not necessary. Just let them know I'm coming. I'll drive over this weekend, maybe. He left early on Saturday morning while the summer heat still smoldered unleashed. He was halfway across New Jersey by 10 o'clock and was pulling into the Vanguard's driveway at noon. Their house was a little white frame place in a little white frame town, sleepy in the summer except when the city cars drove through on the way to the lake. There was a church across the street, and a wedding was in progress. Steve stood for a moment watching the clouds of colored confetti shower down on the squealing bride and happy groom. Some things were the same everywhere, he decided, and lit a cigarette before turning toward the white frame house. He had time for just a few puffs before he discarded it and pressed the doorbell. The woman who came through the dim living room to the latch screen door was younger than he'd expected, with long blonde hair and a good figure. He guessed her to be about his own age, certainly no more than 30. Hello, I'm Steve Foley from Neptune magazine. I believe your husband is expecting me. Oh, yes, Mr. Foley. He stepped in as she unlatched the door. This is quite a treat for us, having an editor drive all the way from New York. I'm Lynn Vanguard, Walt's wife. As if on cue, her husband appeared, tucking the ends of a clean sport shirt into his pants. He was what Steve might have expected, medium height, running just a bit overweight, and thinnish hair, with a ruddy complexion that reflected the outdoor life in a summertime along the Pennsylvania border. Glad to meet you, Mr. Foley, he said briskly. My agent told us to expect you. Steve sat down, trying to feel at ease, telling himself that they seemed friendly enough, yet feeling oddly bothered by something. We're seriously considering using the account of your experience in the October issue, he told them. We just wanted to talk to you in person, and perhaps get a few pictures over where it happened. Lynn Vanguard gave a little shiver of anticipation. We haven't been back there since. It was the most horrible thing ever to happen to me in my whole life. It was almost like a dream, a terrible nightmare. Of course, I've read your article, Steve told Vanguard, but I'd appreciate hearing it from your wife again, just briefly to refresh my memory a little bit, you see. Walt Vanguard smiled thinly. Or to compare our stories. I assure you, they agree. Walt, she seemed to speak a bit sharply. I'd be glad to tell him about it. Then turning to Steve, she began. Actually, it's a very short story. It was the middle of May, and it was the first time we'd been camping this season. The weather was good, a warm evening with lots of stars, but we'd chosen a camping spot a mile or so away from the main area. We don't have any children, and we're always just as happy off by ourselves, away from the other campers. Besides, our dog Jake used to bark a lot at night. You know, just baying at the moon like dogs are supposed to do. What kind of dog was he? Steve asked. She seemed startled. A beagle. Surely that was in Walt's article. I'd forgotten. He lit another cigarette. Sorry I interrupted you. Anyway, we were sitting around the little fire having a few drinks. Jake was off prowling in the underbrush somewhere, and there were the usual night sounds from the woods. I began to feel strange, and so did Walt. It's hard to explain. It's as if we were no longer alone there. All of a sudden, the woods were menacing. The trees seemed to take on a life of their own. There was a noise above us, a sort of flapping. I was frightened, but Walt thought it was just an owl. I was the first to see it, Walt said. I can still remember those big red eyes, big as fists. I started to scream, Lynn Wengard continued. I screamed and I screamed. It was a great scaly thing with wings a good 12 feet across. It came crashing through the trees above us, all red eyes and dripping mouth. Oh, it was horrible. No chance the other campers were playing some sort of a trick on you? Steve asked. Mr. Foley, it was alive! Walt ran for the gun he'd brought along, a single-shot rifle he'd fooled around with sometimes. He fired once and was reloading when Jake ran up barking at the thing. Just where was it then? Above our heads, in the low branches. Your bullet missed him, Mr. Wangard? He rubbed his stubbled chin and thought about it. No, I don't think it hurt him. I have another rifle that I use for hunting, but I hadn't brought it that weekend. The single-shot gun is old, and the sights are no good on it. But I do think I must have hit him, and that range I couldn't miss. We could almost feel its breath on our faces, Lynn Wengard went on. I don't know what just happened next, but suddenly Jake stopped barking, and I guess the creature had him. The thing went away after that and took Jake along. That's it, Wengard said. That's the way it happened. We drove down the road to warn the other campers, but nobody else saw a thing. Sheriff got out of bed to chase around after it the rest of the night, but he didn't see anything either. We made the newspapers, though, even a paragraph on the last page of the New York Times. A week or so later, an old widow with a farm near the spot reported that something was bothering her cows. Said they hadn't been giving as much milk lately, thought it might be they'd been scared by our creature. Steve hadn't bothered to take notes, because it had all been in the article. They seemed to be telling the truth, and even if they weren't, that wasn't really his concern. Mike Eldon's only stipulation was that they may not be obvious crackpots or fakes. They seemed to be neither one. Could I see the place and get some pictures? He asked. We'll drive you over, Wengard said, getting to his feet. It's only about a 40-minute ride from here. The wedding party from the church across the street had gone now, leaving only a tired janitor to sweep up the flecks of colored confetti. Steve sat in the back seat as they drove him down the main street of the town, across jolting railway tracks, and into the rich farmland of the countryside. It took just over a half hour to reach the state park, a solid rise of timberland that cut through the oat fields and across the horizon like some unexpected curtain. The afternoon warmth had spread itself across the landscape, and here in the park, even the Saturday bustle of playing children was muted by the heat. Only at the carefully supervised swimming pool did the noise level give evidence of youthful joy. It was out this way, Lynn told him as they turned off the main pavement onto a well-traveled dirt road. Some campers were in the area now, and they waved as campers will, perhaps expecting someone they knew. Finally, Walt Wengard brought the car to a stop, and they got out under a great old oak that might have been standing in William Penn's day. That was the tree. Wengard pointed up at it. The creature came down right about here and snatched up Jake. Steve nodded and got out the little German camera he'd brought from the office. He snapped pictures of the tree and pictures of Walt and Lynn by the tree, then general pictures of the area. The place seemed awfully harmless in the summer sunshine. "Do you have a photo of the dog that I could have?" he asked. "I think there's one in our scrapbook," Lynn began, and then suddenly choked off her words. Something had happened to her husband. Walt Vanguard had toppled against the tree, his face screwed into a mask of sheer terror. "No, no!" he muttered, clawing at the bark. "It's coming again! Coming!" he screamed. Steve felt the chill on his spine as he followed Lynn's terrified gaze to the treetops, but there was nothing to be seen. Perhaps they were all crazy. Perhaps the world was crazy. Steve shot one quick picture of the huddled man against the tree and then ran over to help Lynn with him. "I can't understand it," she said, truly frightened now. "He's never been like this before." "Let's get him into the car, away from this place." Vanguard was shivering, almost beside himself with fear, as they half carried him to the car. Steve sat with him in the back, while Lynn turned the vehicle toward home. The day was no longer a sunny summer afternoon. Something cold and dark and unknown had thrust itself upon them. Steve remained at a nearby motel overnight, and on Sunday morning he phoned Mike Eldon at his home, filling him in quickly on the previous day's events. "The whole thing might have been an act for my benefit," he concluded. "But if it was, he did a damn good job of it." "You think they really saw this creature?" "Who knows? I talked with a few neighbors last night, and they confirmed the story as much as they could. The dog certainly did vanish that night and hasn't been seen since." Eldon sighed into the phone. "Oh, what about Vanguard? How's he?" "All right. He pretty much snapped out of it by the time we got him back to the house. He can't understand what happened to him." "You got some pictures?" "Yes." "Doesn't seem that you can do too much there. Might as well come back tonight." Steve hesitated and then said, "I'd like to stay over one more night if the expense account could stand it. There's something strange about the whole business." "All right, one more night." Steve hung up and strolled out to the street. Townspeople dressed up for church hurried past. He watched them, then followed along for a ways until he reached the Vanguard Street. Services were just letting out at the little church across from their house, and he waited on the sidelines until a youngish blonde minister finished greeting his parishioners. Steve introduced himself. "I was wondering about the Vanguard's experience," he said, getting quickly to the point. "What do people think of it? How has it affected the town?" The minister looked even younger than Steve, and he spoke with a touch of New England accent that seemed surprising. For a moment, Steve had forgotten that a good many men had followed Franklin's early path from Boston to Philadelphia. "They're good people," he told Steve, smiling up at the sun. "Whatever happened to them, whatever was out there, I believe they told the truth." "But what does the town believe?" The blonde minister shrugged. "The Vanguards are dismissed as harmless. The creature in the woods is only another form of flying saucer, after all." "And how has this affected them?" The minister seemed thoughtful. A woman passed and called, "Good afternoon, Dr. Reynolds." "Good afternoon, Sarah." The smile came automatically to his face, but lingered a bit longer than necessary. He was a pastor who knew his people. Then he answered Steve's question. "Oddly enough, I believe it has brought them closer together. It's no secret that there was actually some talk of divorce before all this happened." "I see," Steve said. "What do you think it was, Dr. Reynolds?" "Not a flying saucer, certainly." "No." "The devil, perhaps?" The blonde minister smiled slightly. "Perhaps. I would never be one to deny it." Steve Foley thanked him and strolled away. The sun was high in a cloudless sky, and he was thinking it would be a good day for a picnic. He spent the afternoon with the Wen guards, lunching on a rough wooden picnic table in the backyard. Walt seemed completely recovered from his seizure of the previous afternoon, and the three of them sat chatting about the town and its people. "The woman who saw your creature," Steve said. "Is she worth talking to?" "She never really said she saw it," Lynn said. "Just that something was bothering her cows. It could have been a small bear. We've had them in the area before." "The woman's something of a crackpot," Walt agreed. "You'll get nothing you can use out of her." Steve nodded. "Then I guess I'll get back to New York in the morning, since my work's about over." "You're staying another night?" "Well, it's a long trip back in the dark. Rather start in the morning." He left them in the late afternoon while the sun was still bright in the western sky. Back at the motel, he read over the manuscript from Walter Wengard once more, waiting until the sky began to turn a mottled midnight blue. Then he got into the car and drove out to the park, to the camping area where Walter and Lynn Wengard had met their creature. The place was different by dark, a silent world where only the occasional sounds of the night creatures intruded upon the subdued campers and stray lovers. Steve passed a few parked cars, pulled off the road into the shielding foliage, then found a parking space of his own near the big tree Lynn and Walt had shown him. He took a flashlight with him when he left the car, but he didn't know exactly what he was seeking. It was just an idea, the beginnings of an idea. Then he heard it, a great whirring of wings from somewhere above. The thing in the tree had been disturbed by his presence. He crouched against the trunk, shooting his flashlight beam into the upper branches. Something flew down at him, blinded by the light, but swerved away at the final instant, chasing its shadow back into the depth of the forest. It was an owl, large and probably very old, but still an owl. Steve relaxed a bit and directed the beam of light toward the ground. He began to walk in an ever-widening circle until he'd gone some 30 feet from the tree in the direction away from the campsite. Then he dropped to his hands and knees to study the earth. Hard to tell after 2 or 3 months, but the soil might have been disturbed, the grass uprooted since its spring growth. Perhaps the breath of the winged creature had scorched it, or perhaps Steve started to scoop the earth away with his hands, then went back to the car and brought a tire iron from the trunk. It took him 10 minutes to funnel a hole a foot deep in the hard soil. That was all he needed. He'd found Jake, the missing dog. Huh. Okay. He drove back into town then, not to the motel, but to the little house across from the church, where Walt and Lynn Wengard lived. The place was in darkness when he reached it a little before midnight. He had to ring the bell 4 times before Lynn appeared at the door, her face a frightened mask, pale and distorted in fear. "Come quickly," she gasped. "He's killed himself." Steve followed her up the stairs, close on her heels, as she snapped on the lights. Finally, at the bathroom door, she flicked the last light switch and stepped aside. Walt Wengard was sitting on the toilet seat with his head and hands in the sink. He was bleeding from both wrists. "Call an ambulance!" Steve shouted over his shoulder. There may still be time to save him." She ran out, and he heard her dialing for help. In a few minutes, the rising siren of an approaching ambulance cut through the outer night. When they arrived with the stretcher, Steve had already managed to stop the bleeding from both wrists. "I'm going with him," Lynn said. "In the ambulance." Her face was a twisted, frightened thing, hardly recognizable. "Wait," Steve insisted. "I'll drive you to the hospital." Her face... His hand was heavy on her shoulder. He stepped onto the front porch and said a few words to the ambulance driver. She was waiting when he returned to the living room, lit now only by a single shaded lamp. "Why wouldn't you let me go? Why?" "Because we have to talk, Mrs. Wengard. We have to talk about your monstrous winged creature. She fumbled for a cigarette. My husband's dying, Mr. Foley. Let's hope not. She blew out the cigarette smoke, nervous, unsure of herself. What do you want me to say? I want the truth. I found the dog tonight, Mrs. Vanguard, where he'd been buried. She sighed and stubbed out the cigarette in a sudden motion of resignation. All right. There never was a creature. Walt made the whole thing up for the story. He killed the dog and buried it. When you started asking too many questions, he tried to kill himself tonight. Is that what you wanted to hear? No, Steve said softly. It was almost over now, nearly at an end, and for an instant he wondered what he was doing here, standing in the dimly lit living room of this little house, playing God. There is a creature, Mrs. Vanguard. There was one that night. Your husband saw it. What did you just tell those men who took him to the hospital? She asked suddenly. I told them to pump his stomach, Steve said. He felt very tired. To get out whatever you fed him. What are you talking about? Mrs. Vanguard, did you walk into the bathroom, find your husband bleeding to death in the sink, and then turn the lights off as you left? Is that what you want me to believe? You've been trying to kill him for 2 months, and I hope to God you haven't succeeded tonight. For an instant, he thought she would throw herself at him, perhaps clawing at his eyes with the unleashed fury of some jungle cat. But the moment passed, and the fight seemed to drain away from her face. She sank back onto the sofa and said very quietly, You really believe that? You know a lot about drugs, don't you? Maybe you were a nurse once, or you have a boyfriend who's a doctor. Maybe you just read a lot. That night at the camping weekend you fed him a hallucinogen or psychedelic drug of some sort, didn't you? You're doing the talking, mister. It might have been LSD, but more likely it was DMT. Dimethyltryptamine, a more intense form that concentrates and compresses the hallucinations into a half-hour period. He might have done almost anything during that half hour, even accidentally killed himself. As it was, he saw an owl or some other bird and imagined a great winged beast. You told the same story and even killed the dog and buried it to back up the tale. The way it worked out was just as good for your plans. He could be killed by the beast at a later date, or a suicide could be arranged. Either way, you'd be in the clear. Of course, he wrote the story about his experience, and then you had to wait. You didn't know what might happen, but I suppose you felt that its publication would strengthen your hand. Walt Vanguard would be judged either a crazed suicide or the victim of some unknown creature, whichever way you wanted to play it. You figured all that out? I had help. The thought of a drug crossed my mind the first time I read Walt's article. It sounded so much like an LSD-created experience. Even if I were right, though, it could have gone either way. Either one of you could have administered the drug to the other and then simply matched your story to the drug-inspired hallucination. But when Walt had his attack in the park yesterday, I knew. Drugs like LSD and DMT sometimes cause repeat hallucinations, days, weeks, or months after the initial effects have worn off. Our visit to that spot triggered just such a reaction in Walt. Later, when I heard you two had been talking about divorce before all this happened, I had a semblance of motive. What was it? Money? I suppose you wanted it all instead of just some alimony. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the floor. You're too late, you know. He's dead. If he is, you're in extra big trouble, lady. They'll find the sleeping potion or whatever it was in his stomach. They'll know you knocked him out before propping him up in the bathroom and cutting his wrists. And yesterday in the park, you figured you had to do something fast, The time seemed right for it while I was on the scene to testify to his mental imbalance. Steve had gotten to his feet, and she asked, "Where are you going now?" "To the hospital, to see how he is. Don't you want to come?" She shivered, curling herself in onto the couch. "No, I don't think so." He left her there with herself because he was not a policeman. Someone would come for her later. As he walked quickly out of the silent house and along the dark street, he saw a queer shape pass across the face of the moon. To some, it might have seemed like a great winged creature, but he knew it was only a cloud. Ah, okay, well, that certainly had another unexpected twist. I'm kind of enjoying these stories. That was some comic relief for you. If you've ever done psychedelics, I'm sure that we can all attest that our experiences can be very different depending on where you are and who you're with and whether or not you were expecting to be under the influence. So, how funny. Thank you for being here this evening. I enjoyed spending this time with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Until then, a little love, a little peace. Stay spooky, you weirdos. Ciao for now.